This is the 36th session of the Gerhard webinar series. It's about the aftermath of COVID-19. Today, we're very lucky to have with us Dr. Frank Aswani, who's the CEO of Africa Venture Philanthropy Alliance, a network of social investors who will collaborate to increase the flow of capital in social investments across Africa and to ensure that the capital is deployed for maximum social impact. Frank is Kenyan. He lives in Johannesburg, Joburg, and he holds a veterinary medicine degree from the University of Nairobi and an MBA from GIBS, University of Pretoria, South Africa. He's going to talk about a very, very interesting topic, which is the gap in the SDG 2030 finance in Africa. Africa needs between $500 billion to $1.2 trillion annually in order to meet its SDG financing gaps. Many African countries are already struggling, and things have been made worse by the COVID crisis. And I look forward to a very enlightening discussion from our guest, Frank, and to tell us exactly how we could bridge this gap. Frank, the floor is yours, my dear.
Ali, thank you so much for hosting me and the Gerhard Center. Really appreciate you allowing me this opportunity to speak to what is really, a burning platform in Africa. We are facing some major challenges on the continent, and the SDGs have provided a framework within which we are able to collectively speak the same language across the private and development sector. So as Ali has mentioned, I'm CEO of AVPA. I hope Ali, you can all see my screen clearly.
Yes, fantastic. It's very clear.
Awesome. Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm the CEO of AVPA. And what I'll take you today, I'll talk to you a bit about AVPA, and then we'll go into the SDG Financing Challenge. I'll summarize to you a couple of my takeaways from my slides, and hopefully we can have an engaging conversation because there is a lot of unknowns around how we solve some of these challenges that we're facing. But this is the time, I think, for many people who are playing the impact space to stand up. This is the time when collaboration should get better than ever before. This is a time for us as a collective to do what we can do better together than we were ever going to achieve individually. So just to start off with, first of all, to introduce AVPA, we, as Ali mentioned, we're a network of social investors who are looking to collaborate for the increase of flow of capital into African social investments, and to ensure that the capital attracted is deployed for maximum impact. When we talk about social investors, we broadly define them as investors deploying capital seeking social returns with varying expectations of financial returns. So to that end, you can see there we aim to attract the likes of foundations, corporates, family offices, amongst other types of social investors. We play along the whole continuum of capital. So we look at providers of grants, debt, and equity, because we believe the blending of that capital is what will help us get the right amount of money into social investments in Africa. But the kind of people we attract are not just providers of financial capital, but also those supplying and providing human and intellectual capital as well. Because we believe that's just as important as financial capital when it comes to creating the right ecosystem to enhance social impact and social investment. We are part of an international sister network of organizations. So as you'll see on the bottom right there, we have sister networks in Asia, Latin America, and Europe. And what that means is that AVPA is able to connect Africans to their peers globally for the movement of financial capital, especially from Asia and Europe into Africa, but also for the cross-exchange and cross-pollination of best practices, both from outside into Africa and vice versa. So that is something I think we're very uniquely positioned to do as part of a broader global ecosystem. When you talk about the social investment ecosystem, as I mentioned, that's kind of our broad definition of social investors. And we play across, if you see there, we play across from the far left, you've got philanthropists, impact investors, and socially responsible investors on the far right. So on your philanthropists basically are seeking zero financial returns and focus mainly on impact first. And when you look at your social responsible investments, they are finance first, but they're also seeking social returns. And that takes us into the space of dealing with what we have just described as a continuum of capital, utilizing a broad set of tools and resources. And the end beneficiaries of all of these tend to be non-profit social enterprise or social sustainable businesses. So that's kind of what our broad ecosystem of social investors and social investment looks like. Our strategic goals are designed to try and address this whole issue of driving social impact on Africa. And so we have 4 of these. The first one is Africa faces a really interesting challenge. And based on our history, we've tended to rely a lot on aid and government funding for our social investment. And the reality is that those are facing some huge challenges and pressures at the moment because mainly of the COVID crisis, but also because our governments in many African countries have borrowed quite heavily. Initially it was for infrastructure projects. Now the COVID crisis has demanded a lot of economic stimuli packages, and those have put huge burdens on public debt. So we need Africans to understand that the traditional sources of funding for social investments, aid and government funding, are not going to be enough to take us to the point where we can meet our 2030 SDG targets. So the first point is really about making sure people understand the problem. How do we plug in that $500 billion to $1.2 trillion gap that we've got? And aid and government funding not going to be enough to get us there. The second thing now that we discussed the problem is how do we get more African social investors involved in this new paradigm and this new space? So we're looking to do some investor education on innovative financing so we can bring more African social investors into this space. And to that end, we especially want to look at people who are deploying smaller ticket size transactions where a majority of our Africans sit, so under $10 million or so. When we set out to achieve that objective, we made some assumptions and we wanted to actually do that particular initiative and design training programs and other interventions using African knowledge partners. To our surprise, when we started looking across the continent of Africa has only one institution that offers an innovative financing program, and that's the University of Cape Town. So if you want to go across Africa and to use an African knowledge partner to design and run innovative financing program, you have one choice. That's a big problem. And what that means, if we have got to do this, we've got to rely on other institutions in Europe and the US, namely Oxford, Cambridge, Duke, Stanford. And the challenge of doing that is Oxford or Cambridge will come to Africa, they'll train 20, 30 people, go away, having charged you an arm and a leg, most likely, and then come back 6 months later. We don't have that luxury of time. We need to accelerate how we bring more African social investors to play actively in this new space of innovative financing. So AVPA has changed its objective there. Now, what we're trying to do is we are trying to create an association of Pan-African innovative financing institutions. So we want to bring together 30 or 40 Pan-African universities and business schools, and then into an umbrella body on innovative financing, and then have your Oxford, Cambridge, University of Cape Town train these 30 or 40 in innovative financing so they can go back home to their respective countries and create centers of excellence in innovative financing within their own respective countries and much closer to their social investors. That way, we can train 1,000 to 2,000 Africans a month on innovative financing and really build critical mass to drive this process forward. We believe we can do to innovative financing and flow of capital and social investments what the cell phone did to financial inclusion through mobile money on the continent. And so we're looking for a donor to help us fund that particular part of the program on investor education. The third thing in terms of strategic goals is we recognize if we've got to crowd in private sector capital into social investments, we need to have our grant makers diversify the investment strategy. Currently, a lot of grant makers deploy almost all their capital purely as grants. Would like to see a lot of them playing more in the catalytic investment space and catalytic grant making. but that takes a bit of a transition and a process of education and helping them make the change. And this means empowering both the management and the boards of these organizations to see their role as bridesmaids in making this capital flow into African social investments from the private sector possible. And then the fourth thing there is really about us connecting social investors, like actors like we're doing today, and like we've been doing this week. We've had a really busy week, and I'll talk a bit about that later on. So the problem that we're trying to solve in Africa, $500 billion to $1.2 trillion annually between now and 2030 is what Africa needs to finance its SDG gap. And traditionally, as I mentioned, we've depended on domestic revenues. Those currently total about $500 billion. And I'll first of all want to acknowledge the SDGs Center in Kigali for some of the data I'm going to use today, and some of it from AVPA. If you look at, so domestic revenue is about $500 billion across the continent. Aid is about $50 billion. FDI is about $48 billion. And remittances in Africa are a major revenue source for us at about $60 billion. But also we lose about $70 billion in illicit flows, mainly from trade invoicing across the continent. So if you just look at domestic revenues, ODA, FDI, they still don't get us close to the $1.2 trillion. So the question is, how do we close that gap? And if you look at the financial markets in globally, those have about $320 trillion, and the capital markets about $250 trillion. So our only solution is to see how we can make social investments attractive for the private sector players in the financial and capital markets to invest in them. But the perception a lot of private players have of social investments is that they're very risky. And so this is where we bring the various players together along the continuum of capital, and how do we get grant makers to de-risk social investments so the private sector players can deploy some of the capital into the social investment space. We've just completed, literally yesterday, we had a presentation presenting our social investment landscape mapping study. For those of you who missed it, please go to our website. The study is now up. You can access the study on our website. And the recording from yesterday's presentation will be available in the next, by end of this week on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, on our website. But we're also rolling out the regional reports. So tomorrow we're doing the Southern Africa report. On the 17th, we do the East Africa report. And on the 19th, we do the West Africa report. So you'll find all of that under the events page on our website. Nonetheless, this is some of the data that came out of the study. It says we're still underperforming broadly in Africa with regards to SDG performance. Now, I want to make it also stated clear that North Africa is doing much better and seems to be on track to meeting the SDG targets, but Sub-Saharan Africa will be struggling. And this has all more been made worse by the COVID crisis. So you can see there relatively how the various regions in Africa are doing from an SDG perspective. And I'll cover this a bit more as we go along. So some other data that came out of the study that we did, which I've mentioned to you, the funding gap is inadequate. And now you can see some specific data there regarding to the latest findings we had. So you can see in East Africa, aid is reducing. It's reduced by about 2%. West Africa has gone up mildly by 4%. In Southern Africa, it's reduced significantly by 20%. Now, some of the reductions are also driven by the fact that a lot more of our African countries are moving into middle income status, so they become less deserving of aid. If we look at FDIs, we've seen an increase in FDIs in East Africa and a reduction in Western and Southern Africa. But all of this, once again, this data, remember we're doing this study from November 2019. This data is likely to look worse in the COVID or post-COVID recovery phase. So it's, we are facing some really tough challenges, and tax revenue is no different. So you can see the averages there, and East Africa 10%, West Africa 12.2%, Southern Africa 18.4%, and Southern Africa is heavily influenced by South Africa. But if you compare to the OECD countries, their tax rate revenue as percent of GDP is at 34%. So there's a big difference you see between Africa and the rest of the world, and that means the government's revenue is under huge challenge to not only meet its recurring expenses, but also finance social investment. So this gives another context of that particular slide that I mentioned. I want to talk a bit more about remittances because we have a lot of African diaspora working in either Europe or the US or in the Middle East, and they send a lot of money home. But that it's projected that because of COVID, there will be a huge reduction of almost 25% in remittances to Africa. And the last line there, you can see about the debt. So we're seeing quite a bit of pressure on public debt in Africa. So a country like South Africa was projected to probably end the year at about 80% public debt to GDP. They think that will go to almost close to 100%. And the story is very similar from a trend perspective in many countries across Africa. I mentioned about the tax, and you can see exactly what I was talking about. This covers a wide range of countries. You can see Egypt, most of you here are from Egypt, at about 17%, with South Africa, where South Africans are probably one of the most taxed Africans, you know, when you compare them to the rest. But you can get a sense of kind of the tax rates in Africa. And this puts huge pressure on the ability of governments to collect revenue to plow back in social investments of the continent. Ultimately, all of this is also driven by the country's ability to grow to meet its SDG targets. Pre-COVID, we were required to be growing at about 7%. Now, if you remember a couple of years, maybe 2-3 years ago, the Africa GDP growth rate was phenomenal. So we were about almost half of the top 20 countries in the world from a GDP growth perspective were African. That's been hugely affected by the COVID crisis and also by commodity prices fluctuating quite a bit. Oil-dependent economies in Africa have been badly hit by the COVID crisis as well, and also being hit by other issues, for example, as more and more countries move to green energy. But this gives you a sense of where we need to be and where we are. And it picks on a select couple of countries, most of them Southern Africa. But you can see even between 2017 and 2018, we're way under the 7% GDP required growth to get us to meet our 2030 SDG targets. If you talk about food security, insecurity, you can see North Africa is probably the closest to food insecurity, to achieving food security. We have huge gaps in East and Central Africa as well. So once again, this shows you how we are still going to be struggling with quite a number of things to look at when we talk about the various SDG challenges we've got. On education, Africa's done fairly well on this end. I think our enrollment has improved tremendously over the last couple of years. I know in countries like South Africa, it's practically almost at 100%. But this gives you a sense, once again, this is probably one of the targets where we've done relatively well on the continent. And in many countries, kids have an opportunity to go to school. What in fact is now becoming the issue is not so much the quantity of kids going to school, but the quality of education that they're receiving. And how can we improve on that? And also make the quality of education be relevant to the future, because the challenge of education today is that we're preparing kids for jobs that don't exist, for technology that hasn't been invented, and to solve problems that we haven't fully conceptualized yet. So that creates a big challenge from that perspective. Access to basic water gives you a very similar structure, and this has been made worse by global warming. And you can see where the world is and where the rest of Africa is. Southern Africa is generally a very dry country. And in South Africa, for example, only 9% of the country receives enough rain to grow rain-fed crops. And yet agriculture uses 60% of South Africa's water. But South Africa is unique in the sense it has a lot of large commercial agriculture in the country compared to other countries which have a lot more smallholder farmers. So that gives you a sense of kind of that gap around basic access to basic water. Access to electricity, same story. We have very few countries in Africa that actually are pulling their weight in the right direction. Big gaps exist. But one thing I want people to recognize that the SDGs are not necessarily just a pain. They offer some huge business opportunities. If you have time, please read a report from Standard Chartered called Opportunities 2030. that talks about something like $1.4 trillion in just 3 SDGs of business opportunities. So if you look at the white spaces between the blue bars and the 2030 target, some people might think, oh, Malawi has such, is a basket case because there's such low access to electricity. Yeah, on the other hand, you might think actually Malawi offers a great opportunity for people who have solutions in renewable energy, people offering solar lamps and solar lights and those kind of things. There's massive opportunities for people looking in that space. So I think it's not necessarily about the glass being half full. Is the glass being empty, and that emptiness requires entrepreneurs and solution providers to jump in and offer great solutions as they make some decent revenue in the process. So that gives a sense of where that is. The graph on the right is fairly worrisome because we have a very young population in Africa. Our average age is 19. If you compare to Europe or Asia, I think Europe is at almost 45 or 47, something like that. The US is at about 40, 44, 41. Japan's at 51. We are at 19. So one of the biggest issues we're facing is youth unemployment on the continent, and how do we create enough opportunities for our young people? And this is probably our biggest risk on the continent. So this will only come if there's enough economic opportunities to drive forward the setting up of small businesses, SMEs, that will create the right jobs for young people. But otherwise, we run a big risk. And you can see signs sometimes in many parts of Africa now and then that signal the unrest amongst our young people on the continent. So to almost summarize kind of where we are now, here we bring in some North Africa data and information. You can see the keys on your right-hand side. So North Africa seems to be on track to meeting a lot of this. Now, once again, this was pre-COVID. We've got to have a look at what COVID has brought to this space. But the rest of the sub-Saharan Africa has some challenging times ahead. But once again, as I said, anything that's not green is an opportunity for intervention, is an opportunity to create change, is an opportunity to create new partnership and collaboration. And that's the kind of stuff that AVPA is trying to do. How do we bring some of these challenges into opportunities that can really bring about some innovative ideas and resource mobilization to help address some of those gaps? So another way to also look at that particular problem, and you can see once again, not too many greens across, and this is in 2019, but we have 10 years to get there. 10 years that have been made all the more difficult by COVID, and we've lost quite a bit of the gains we've made before then. But nonetheless, I think there's nothing that humanity has not been able to solve. And this calls for some real courageous intervention and players and new alliances to be formed that can be able to bridge this gap. So I thought this slide would be very interesting to share with you because it shows the relative correlation or between the SDGs index and Mo Ibrahim's index on governance. And, you know, generally, it's almost no surprise that some of the best governed countries have perform better on the SDG index. It's not broad generalization, but there's a general trend in that direction. And if you look at the ones that are circled in red there, they have certain issues that we all are aware of in many cases, either from a leadership perspective, governance, unrest, and those kind of things. And you'll see that at the end of the day, our governments that perform well and offer the right environments really can showcase and help the ecosystems in their respective countries deliver on the SDGs. So just some key takeaways for you in here. I think when it comes to SDG financing, we've got to be looking at the private markets. And the issue is how do we bring these non-traditional partners together for increased collaboration? How do we bring together private players with grant makers? We've also got to champion catalytic capital investment because catalytic capital is what will unlock a lot of the private investments. And that comes with adequate investor education and innovative financing specifically. So we've spoken about how those are things that, if we've got to do this at scale, speed, and with the right reach across the continent, these are non-negotiables in many cases. And we've got to establish also the right toolkits training program and alternative funding models for nonprofits. That came out very strongly from our landscape study that we just did. So that SDG financing bit is core to what we at AVPA stand for and how we can help Africa mobilize more capital into this space. There's no question that the policy and governance spaces have to improve. We need to do better at looking at the legal and regulatory framework. So if you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, it's only in South Africa where you get tax breaks for donating to nonprofits. Okay, in the rest of the continent, at least I'm sure about Sub-Saharan Africa, I'm not sure about North Africa. You have no incentive to donate grant capital to nonprofits. We're only now seeing social entrepreneurship policies coming up. So Kenya have got their first policy that's about to go into parliament to be enacted into an act. South Africa have just pulled together a couple of people to work on their social entrepreneurship policy. So there's a lot of that stuff that we're starting to see. Tunisia has a startup act which has been copied by Senegal, Rwanda, and a couple of other countries in Africa now looking to roll that out. But the problem also we have in Africa is we're too slow in rolling some of these things out, and we need to do that a lot more effectively with speed and at scale. So one of the things we are also going to be doing at AVPA is creating a policy platform and policy forum that will help inform the continent policymakers on what are the policy incentives that you could do, what could you learn from other Africans in terms of what they're doing to make your space more suitable for social investors to thrive. And we'll also not just lean on African lessons and learnings, we'll also work through our sister networks in Asia and Latin America and Europe to see what have they learned, what are the mistakes they have made, what are the lessons they've learned that we can learn and accelerate ourselves. So we've already started doing that kind of stuff with the sister network. So please, we'd like to see how we can collaborate with policymakers as we look at also looking at the current laws and policies around corporate social investments and tax incentives. So that whole policy stuff is something I think Africa needs badly. You may also know, and you may have heard that there are NABs across the continent. NAB is the National Advisory Boards for Impact Investing. These are bodies that have been set up in collaboration with the Global Steering Group for Impact Investing, GSG, and they've been mandated to, in essence, grow and scale the adoption of impact investing in various countries. Africa has 5 NABs on the continent so far. So there are NABs in Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, Ghana, and Zambia. We as AVPA sit on the Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa NABs, and we're trying to leverage our presence to also, soon we're in conversation to see if we can also sit on the Ghana and Zambia NAB and play that kind of an African connector of these NABs so we can move lessons around quicker, and with our connections in Europe and Asia through our sister networks there as well, to see what we can pull in from the NABs in those 2 continents. And then the final thing I think we also need to do is collect data. Data informs us where the opportunities are, where the gaps are, where the leakages are, and that we haven't done a great job of. So hopefully we can do a better job at that. I'm about to wrap up. So I just wanted to remind you once again, we've got some really exciting stuff happening at AVPA. Please join us. Our website is avpa.africa. If you go to our events page, you'll see we've just launched our social investment landscape mapping study. We had the official Pan-African launch yesterday. We've got 3 upcoming launches, as you can see there, in the next 2 weeks. We've also very excitedly ready to go with our deal share platform. And this is a platform designed to make it easy for investors who are looking for growth, scale, or exit capital to find other partners, other co-investors. Or if you're an investor looking for deal flow, you can very easily get that deal flow on the deal share platform. So we're super excited about that particular deal share platform. Our Asian sister network has had a very successful deal share platform in Asia, and we believe ours will have just an equal impact on the continent. The third platform that we're also ready to go live with, it's also live on the platform, and you can see it, is our gender platform. And we've got 3 communities of practice underneath that gender platform. There's a health and safety, economic empowerment and livelihoods, and gender-lens investing. So please feel free to join us. In fact, we are in the process of recruiting pilot partners for the DealShare platform and the gender platform. So if you want to come, it's risk-free. We don't charge you anything during this pilot phase to join the DealShare platform and the gender platform, but you come and engage and connect with other Africans solving similar problems. So Ali, I think I'll stop there and I'm happy to take questions.
Frank, thank you. Thanks a lot. I have few comments and maybe a question, and then I'll start taking questions, comments and questions from the audience. The first thing I want to comment on, and I want to commend you on it, is the slide you have where you put the finance ecosystem. I think one way that you could really bridge the gap relatively is if you synchronize and coordinate across the different ways of finance or different ways of payment for social endeavors. When you look at philanthropy, venture philanthropy, most people tend to look at it in isolation from traditional finance. And the way I see that you're looking at it at early stage, high risk kind of investment of initial startups with a social intention, which is the right way to sort of look at it.
Yeah, you're very right. You're very right, Ali. On that note, I think we've got to start thinking differently and less about the source of capital, but the type of capital that's being made available. I think traditionally we've kind of looked at philanthropy and said you only give money for free, and there's certain things that you need to do. And then we've looked at private capital and thought, oh, that's the more complicated type of capital and needs to go to certain type of investments. The reality is that we can blend this capital and use it right across, but blend it particularly for impact in the social space. So I agree with you, and I think that paradigm shift is what we badly need at the moment, and that's why some of the intervention programs I showed you are really about driving mindset shifts amongst our investors, but also breaking down silos. So that's why AVPA is a pretty unique space in the sense that, first of all, we're an investor-only network. We don't take in recipients of capital, we take in only deployers of capital. And then we're deliberately geared to bring together. It's probably the only platform where a philanthropist will be sitting in the same place with an impact fund, a private equity fund, a government, and a DFI. So these silos have to break down. And we're all about, one of the things we tell our people when we start our meetings with multiple investors is we commit to leaving our egos and logos outside, because right where we want to be is egoless and logoless, and be there as people with an interest in solving some of the social problems the continent is facing.
Lovely. I'm recruiting speakers for the webinars for the spring, and I was talking to a fellow friend about she's in a European university, and she was talking about blended finance, which is really the big wave. Now, the interesting about blended finance, you're actually putting philanthropy with the typical finance at the same time, and the philanthropy money would sort of mitigate the early risk of the investment, but you're putting them at the same time, which actually I think it's a way of making financing what could be risky social enterprises or social ideas more appealing to typical financing houses.
Yeah, I mean, blended finance has proven to be really successful. But if you look at the blended finance implementation, and blended finance is very big in East Africa, especially. East Africa is really on the continent, the home of blended finance. But it's been applied a lot on mega projects like wind farms, infrastructural projects, and not so much on smaller projects where majority of our social investors play in. But there is a lot of room for blended finance to play a role there. I was involved in a project a couple of months ago where I had a philanthropist who used to give $1 million to these 30 or 50 women's group, 30 to 50 women groups every year. And every year he'd come back and give $1 million. And then what he decided was, okay, so let's try something different. So what he did was he took his $1 million and put it in a bank as a loan guarantee. And the bank was then able to give the recipients concessional loans, much more loans at much more reduced rates. And over a 12 to 18-month period, this so everyone was worried, would they be able to pay back and those kind of things? But over an 18-month period, these guys borrowed 3-4 times. Their assets grew by almost 400%. And the facility in return got 2 to 3%. And the philanthropist ended up with a facility that he didn't need to reinvest every year because he ended up with a revolving fund. So there are different types of models for different types of players, deploying different types of capital. But the problem we have is unconscious incompetence amongst our social investors. Many of them don't know what they don't know about how to play in this innovative financing space. So we've got to bring them up to speed with programs that enable them to understand better what innovative financing is, how do they play in blended finance, and what are the tools available for them for different types of projects. Because the thing about innovative financing, almost all the structuring is bespoke. There's not one that you can necessarily copy and paste. So one of the other things that AVPA has done, we've just signed an MOU with Convergence Finance. Convergence Finance is probably the most famous innovative financing organization in Africa. And the MOU positions us to work with them to promote blended finance on the continent, and for us to more focus on the smaller ticket size investor, people playing in the under $10 million range, because that's where there's a lot of lack of know-how on blended finance.
Absolutely. I think the training, the education that you're talking about, and bringing schools of business to educate in innovative finance, or more of democratizing finance, or ways of hedging, or making social investment more appealing to typical finance. And part of it, not just education, you're changing the mindset. And I think this is very critical. Very critical. I
actually think with that particular program, Ali, with that particular program, within 6 months, we can have Africa have the highest concentration of innovative financing institutions in the world. If we get it right, and we get 30 or 40 of these institutions into that program, Africa can have the highest concentration of innovative financing institutions in the world, and that will shift the game completely.
Sure. I just wanted also to add North Africa to the Africa that AVPA is working with.
You'll see my name is Aswani. It's from not Egypt. So when I think about Africa, I think about I think about North Africa as well. Completely, Ali. Our vision of AVPA is in the long run to cover the whole continent. We just have a starting point in Sub-Sahara today, but the vision is definitely to go fully Pan-African. That's why even for like the DealShare platform and for the Agenda platform, we're opening up for the whole continent. So North Africans are very free to join the platforms as well.
Lovely. I have one comment about your graph where you try to show the correlation between the Mo Ibrahim governance index and the SDG performance.
Yeah.
I just want to comment, when you look at the Mo Ibrahim index, there are lots of parts there, lots of items that are actually SDG related. There is a whole group under human development, which has health, has education, it has social equity. I mean, there are lots of things that are related. There is also participation, which they talk about gender, they talk about inequality and inclusiveness. And then there is infrastructure for business, where they talk about infrastructure, which is, again, one of the SDGs. So the reason, because when you look at it, it's really a nice line. It's really a nice line. So I think I'm not trying to sort of deny that governance is extremely important in whatever you do, because this is what's going to enable you. You need to work in teams, because all the problems are horizontal, and they tend to be holistic and across and systemic. You really have to have many parties working together, which is number 17. Number 16 is what actually enables you to collaborate with others, because this is about governance, this is about rule of law, this is how you create trust, this is how we can work with you. Yep. So without 16 and 17, you cannot do anything. So for me, when you talk about 16 missing, this is just, it's just terrible. It's just terrible.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely correct. But I think the point behind this slide is the enabling environments that a lot of governance-related decisions provide for the players to thrive, for the capital to flow, and it just gives a correlation. It not necessarily gives an attribution, but it gives a correlation to see how that is done. And it's also things like structures of how capital flows. We know in certain countries, for example, it will be things like corruption, because also the governance here looks at things like corruption. So part of the challenge is money could be lost through the governance systems of government just because of corruption. And that has the negative effect of having money not reach the SDG targets it's supposed to set out to achieve.
Absolutely.
So the lot
The governance part in the Mo Ibrahim Index is by far more advanced than the SDGs. The SDGs, there are lots of missing gaps in comparing to the governance.
Yeah.
This is one of the SDG issues, but I think they were sort of overwhelmed with the many other parts.
Yeah.
What I'm going to do now, I'm going to allow questions, and I'm going to ask each one to sort of, and I'm going to start with Roland Bardi. So please unmute yourself, Roland.
Thank you. I'm a European, and I always listen to Gerhard because it's just wonderful. What I was amazed is seeing the ranking of the performance, where you say climate change is performing well in the completion of SDG goals in several countries, while sanitation, water, electricity is not so performing so well. And this gives me a suspicion, because in Europe, we talk too much about mitigating the increase of temperatures. We do not talk so much about mitigating the effects of climate change. And that was my question. Hopefully, what we talk about when you say performing well in this goal is the mitigation of the consequences. Meaning, like you say, wind farming, but you gave an answer to me. You say that about blending the funding sources. So a donor may wish to pursue, like you say, water, specific project like wind farming, but then you can blend by mixing various sources, by blending that funds that objective with objectives which are rather pounded in the social sphere. And that's where my experience in Africa is Ghana. Unfortunately, it's not on your SDG and goal, SDG and corporate governance index. Why? I don't know why, but from the northern part of Ghana, I know there are so many other goals that should be reached, and not just reducing the climate increase in the world. Thank you.
Yeah. Roland, first of all, thank you for your question. Yeah, I think you have a point in a sense. So part of the problem is, if you look at things like water and sanitation and how they're defined in the SDG framework, the problem with Africa is that we're starting from a very low base on a lot of those things. And so our ability to catch up is taking a lot longer. And it's been made worse by a couple of things like our population growth. We are growing by almost 1 million people a month. Okay? And so those are some of the challenges. Now, if you look at so things like water sanitation are very population dependent. So as much as it's almost as if you're digging one hole to fill another. As much as you're putting in money, you're also having to deal with a lot more people who need the services. So it's the relativity of resources available for that. But that's why we also need to be smart about how we solve some of those problems. And whereas you think about climate change, actually, with Africa and with regards to climate change, we're climbing the tree from the top. Things like global warming in Africa, because of less industrialization and stuff, we haven't had that much of the impact of climate change in Africa. But it's getting worse as we go through more deforestation, increased industrialization. So we're approaching it from a different angle from, let's say, where Europe is coming from. So ours is more about retaining our status and improving, rather than Europe, which is trying to slow down the pollution and those kind of things that's going into the climate. So I think it's an issue which angle you look at the data and the information. But water and sanitation is a very basic human need that not enough Africans are running water. There are proper sanitation things, and as more families in rural Africa get more children, it makes the situation worse, for example. So there's all those sorts of things that are also being created by the crisis of population growth. Okay.
Thank you. The next is, hope I'm saying the name correctly, Nitsafo. Please unmute yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ntsapho, and thank you so much for the engagement and the nice session. So I just have a question. I just wanted to find, I'm sorry, I joined the session later, had technical issues. So I just wanted to find out, does AVPA fund startup organizations, or is it only for already existing social enterprise? I think that's...
Ntsapho, are you in South Africa?
Yes, I'm in South Africa.
Okay, it's good to see someone from South Africa on the call. So first, thank you for your question. So let me also make this very clear. AVPA does not do any funding. We are more enablers and facilitators of the funding ecosystem. Okay. So we bring together the investors who will fund NGOs and social enterprises, and we try and make it easy for them to connect and deploy capital into NGOs and social enterprises. Okay, so that's kind of what we do. So we're not funders ourselves, so we don't run a fund now. So we try and make it as easy as possible to for people coming from outside or coming to Africa, or even Africans within, deploy capital effectively. So, for example, on Monday we hosted an event for a European company that wants to set up a primary healthcare fund in Africa. And one of the things they want to do is fund early stage startups that are playing in the healthcare space. So our job is to then see how can they get those startups access to a deal flow of those startups? How can they get African investors who are already investing in those startups to co-invest with them? How can they get other African investors to also contribute to that fund? And what else do we need to inform them? So part of what the study is doing, for example, is to help the European fund understand the landscape in Africa, who's doing what, where, what are the policies in different countries, what are the regulations in different countries. So when they're coming in, we help give them a soft landing onto the continent.
Okay, thank you so much for the clarity, Frank. Truly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, Kariman, you have a question or comment? Oh boy, I think we've lost it again. Okay, I have a comment about some of the SDGs that are lacking. One of the SDGs that is lacking is health, and it's lacking across. When you look at the other ones, I mean, I think health is probably one of the. I think it's the only one that is shared across the different regions in Africa, which is extremely alarming. It's extremely alarming. And you could argue that it's because health, maybe it's very, I mean, unless you're talking about middle class or middle income or higher income, it's not really financially rewarding.
Yeah, so you're totally correct in that context. You know, I was having a conversation yesterday, in fact, with a fund that is playing in the health space. And you're right, health is not one of those areas that has huge returns. Health is also not an area that, you know, if a bank gave, for example, if a bank gave money to a hospital and a hospital could not pay back, they don't want to be seen in the press as having to close the hospital, to sell the assets, to recover their money. So health comes with this real risks, and hence it's not been a very attractive places for a lot of private capital players. But having said that, with the possibilities being presented by things like blended finance and other kind of initiatives like outcome-based financing, we're starting to see health attract a lot more capital. not to the scale that you'd see in energy or a couple other sectors, but those wheels are turning. And that's why at AVPA, we're also trying to see how we can help health investors find each other, aggregate capital, and be able to have transformative impact. So the initiative I was talking to you about that we co-hosted on Monday was being created by Philips, the European company, and it has 3 buckets. It's focusing almost entirely on primary healthcare, but it has a first bucket that looks at just supporting new ideas before they are proof of concept. So how do you provide high-risk grant capital for new emerging ideas on healthcare on the continent? The second pillar looks at how do we scale and grow proven models, okay? And there's a fund that's looking to do that. The third pillar looks at supporting large-scale government funding with through donor and DFI funded funding, and that's looking at purely things like outcome-based financing and project-based financing in some cases. So those 3 buckets are part of what the fund is trying to create, and we're helping them bring together investors to do that kind of. So that's part of what AVPA does, is that if there are any people who want help to come and see how they can set up structures to support them to aggregate capital on the continent, we're willing to do that kind of stuff.
Lovely. There are many healthcare innovations in India. I mean, the one that comes right away in mind is Arvind Eye Care Hospital. Now, Arvind are really providing premium care, eye care, cataract operation, basically. So it's really excellent. And their conformance quality is much higher than most of the rest. So what they do, they use what's called cross-subsidy. The people who could afford to pay would pay, but they would still pay for a better quality product, cheaper than other competitors. And at the same time, they're subsidizing people who cannot afford. But I guess to do those kind of things, you need to sort of have an innovative kind of an accounting mechanism, or the way you would assess a corporation, which might require changing the regulations and the laws, and maybe giving the entity a little bit more of a tax cut kind of a mindset.
Yeah. I mean, it's very interesting you mentioned that because you're so right. I was in India in November. And one of the things, I haven't been to India for maybe 15 years or something. So I went back to November. And one of the things I couldn't help recognize is just how close Asia is to Europe in many ways and many means. So the problems they're trying to solve in Asia are very similar to Africa, but they're probably 5 or 10 years ahead of us in many cases. And one of the things I was there looking at is some youth unemployment solutions. And, you know, in Africa, looking at youth unemployment as our biggest risk, one of our biggest risks, I was trying to see what can we learn from Asia. And we're all trying to invent things in Africa. We all want to do our own projects. Our projects are not scaling because we don't look at what's already working on the continent that we can paste and tweak a bit. So I was surprised that in India, they have 3 programs running in schools that are designed to help young people while they're in school develop entrepreneurial mindsets. So you don't get surprised when Indians are very entrepreneurial. They have 3 programs, and these 3 programs are in like 50,000 schools in India. 50,000 schools, okay? So we look at that kind of stuff and think, well, hang on a second. As Africa, we don't necessarily need to reinvent everything from scratch. What can we learn from the rest of the world that we can bring to the continent? So one of the things that we've been very deliberate about, working with our Asian network specifically, is to try and see and bridge the gap between Asia and Africa and see what are the solutions that Asia is implementing in very similar circumstances to Africa that we can learn from, that mean that we don't have to reinvent the wheel from scratch. And healthcare offers a really good opportunity to do that. Now, one of the things that India has, for example, Ali, and I think you'll know this, is they have a very strong human capital base. India has a lot of universities producing a lot of doctors. So they have the kind of human capital base that they can afford to do some of those things at much lower costs. So we also have to recognize the kind of things that that we have on the continent. But having said that, in Africa, we also have fairly decent emerging technologies that are supporting these kind of things. But the partners are willing to come and work in Africa. So we'll be actively working with our partners in Asia and Latin America to see what can we learn from them that we can bring to Africa and vice versa.
Lovely. India also has affinity or a mindset for frugal innovation, which what we really need in Africa. I mean, we tend to copy expensive solutions from Europe
Yes.
and North America instead of being a little bit more pragmatic and going more toward a frugal kind of an innovation. Now we're running out of time, and I think we could sort of. It's been a pleasure, tremendous pleasure to have you with us. The discussion has been very open. I mean, mind-opening and very inspiring. And I really thank you for your contribution, Frank.
No, Ali, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk. I'm hoping this is the beginning of many engagements. I've put my email address on the chat group for anyone who wants to get in touch with me. But please, as I mentioned to everyone, this is a problem we're in a very exciting space. People look at Africa and think, oh, you're a basket case of many problems. But actually, I think if you're an impact player globally and you want a sandbox of opportunities to create change, Africa is the place to be. You cannot be in the impact space without being in Africa. We offer our problems are fantastic opportunities for people to create significant global change. So the mindset we need to take into this space is we are the market for that's able to attract the kind of capital and innovation to really drive global change. So I want us to have a very positive mindset as a continent, and AVP will help you get there. We'll help you connect, we'll help you scale ideas, access capital where we can. And if you're an investor looking to deploy capital and you're looking for partners, we are very open to being part of your pathway to the continent as well. But others, thank you to everyone. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Frank. And for sure, the Gerhard Center and perhaps even the School of Business, we're very interested in the idea of innovative finance. And I'll get in touch with you, later, probably next week, and we can talk further how we can actually materialize something.
Okay.
Thank you to the audience for attending. We will take a break the next 2 weeks. We're breaking for Thanksgiving and exams at AUC. And then we're going to start in December 2nd with a very interesting webinar. The webinar is about universal basic income. There are lots of sort of arguments whether it makes sense or it doesn't make sense. We're bringing Louise Haag. She's a professor, Department of Politics, University of York. And she actually has a nice book about UBI. And I think you will learn a lot about what is UBI and what are the pluses or negatives about it. Thank you again. Please stay tuned. And again, I thank our guest speaker, Frank Aswani. Thank you.
Thank you.